بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والمؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة ويطيعون الله ورسوله أولئك سيرحمهم الله إن الله عزيز حكيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Elders, sisters, brothers, friends, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yesterday, and a little bit on the days before, but yesterday especially, we spoke about happiness, being upbeat, understanding why we are here, where we come from, and looked at the lives of examples, role models, how they've managed to maintain their positive mindset, their activism, their contribution to society, their success. We gave examples from Imam Ali alayhi salam and his life, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, Sayyidah Khadija alayhi salam, and others. Imam Zain al-Abidin. How these individuals managed to not just lead as infallibles, but to educate a whole community to maintain a positive, productive, upbeat mindset where they understood the purpose of this life versus what happens in the afterlife, and the role of the Day of Judgment as a point you move across rather than as an end. And this illustrates a very important concept, an important concept that would help us when we make decisions. Our theme, you remember, is all about behavioral biases, how we make better decisions, both that would impact our lives, our lives in this world, and our lives beyond death for the afterlife. You notice when you analyze how they have done it, there is always something crucial that comes out. The crucial thing, or a couple of crucial things, apart from the reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding this relationship, that He's there and He's aware and He's supportive, and relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the times of most difficulty, something else emerges in the words they use, in their mindset. That they always understand this life to be part of something bigger. This is not an end, this is part of something bigger. What I'm talking here about is something called reference dependence. Reference dependence makes a lot of difference into how we view the world, how we make decisions, in ways that are far beyond kind of predictable, if you like. It's one of those biases that we do. Essentially, depends how you frame the decision, we will behave differently. In a rational world, it doesn't matter how you frame the question, right? To a computer, if you're solving equations, whether you solve, let's say you have I don't know, 10 variables, 10 unknowns and 10 equations, whether you solve for one, for kind of, let's say, call them A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. If you solve for A first or B first or D first, it doesn't really matter. How you frame the question doesn't matter, because it's a rational process. Wherever you start from, you will end up with the same result. But in the system one world, the intuitive human world, this blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, it depends. Sometimes this system gets it wrong depending on how you frame the question. So when somebody views the world as limited, they will behave in a certain way. When they see this world as a transition, they behave in a very different way. And this doesn't just affect their decisions when they are facing the world and making a decision in the cold state of mind, when things are relaxed, when they can think about it rationally. But rather, Yusuf alayhi salam was able to make the right decision when he was in a position of difficulty. He was under pressure, under duress, under threat, and in a position of attraction to this woman, where she has created for him, but he resisted knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he was able to still do the right thing in that difficult frame of mind. But many people can't do that. And let me give you an example of this reference dependence. If I was to tell you here, just to illustrate, if I was to tell you here, I'm going to be generous, I'm going to give you $1,000, then take 500. This will feel like a loss to you. You will gain 1,000. Maybe put it slightly differently, just to make it more, increase the emphasis. If I give you 1,000 and take 900, it will feel almost like a loss to you. It feels negative. So if I give it to you, then you're happy, and then by the time you get to the door, I say, come back and give me 900. It's negative. If I just give you 100, you'll be very happy. It's positive. Economically, it's the same. I've given you $100. What's different is the frame. You might think this is maybe not very clear, not very obvious. If you've been following the news, the financial crisis, what happened, the market, a lot of people who bought their homes at a high price, then the market collapsed, didn't sell. A lot of the people who bought when the markets were low and they increased, then they decreased, they sold. So those who bought houses when the markets were cheap and they went up, they made a lot of money despite the crisis. Those who bought when the market was high, they held on and went deeper and deeper and deeper into debt until banks took their homes, and then that's how the subprime bubble kind of burst, and we had the major financial crisis. Another example, when somebody buys a stock in a company, if you invest, and the price goes up, people tend to hold on or sell, but they don't usually buy a bit more because it's going up. It should be positive. You should be reinforcing your idea that this is a good thing, you should buy. However, when you buy something and the price goes down, you hold on. That should tell you this is a losing deal. You were wrong in the first place. What we do is we hold on. Sometimes we double down because the market is low so that we can go back to baseline, so that we can recover our losses. This is a major phenomenon that affects a lot of bankers, a lot of investors, a lot of people. What I'm driving towards here is something very crucial, is that when we view the world as a gain, we are risk averse. When we view the world as a loss, a situation as a loss, we are risk taking. Essentially, when we're desperate, we take risks. When we think we're okay, we don't. And gain and loss, as I just illustrated to you, depends on your reference. One maybe salient current example, you notice the terrorists of ISIS, for example, and other terrorists like those, when you look at their records, a lot of them had criminal records in the past. A lot of them are people who have been radicalized, have been framed in a position where they feel they have done so much bad in their lives. The only way for them to kind of get to baseline, for them to have a chance at heaven, is to do something really crazy. This is not a rational movement. This is not a rational decision. It's a decision based on desperation. It's risk-taking because you're in a lost frame of mind. If you tell the same people that there is a forgiving God, that there is a path, that there is still hope, that you have a chance, they would never do something crazy like that. They would never go and kill innocent people. It's to do with framing. It's all to do with how you see the world. Is it a situation of desperation? And there's a lot of evidence for this, that when people feel desperate, they start to take risks that are unreasonable and do crazy things. It's all to do with how you view the world rather than the reality of the situation. And so, why is this important? It is important because when we come here as individuals and try and fit in a society, any society, we try to we compare our situation to the previous situation. Yesterday I was talking about us followers of Ahlul Bayt don't suffer from that problem. We are positive, we are optimistic, we are looking to change the world positively, to propagate the message of Hussein, to teach, to study. This positive frame of mind helps us, through the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, avoid terrorism, avoid problems, avoid committing crazy things. This is an important part of the frame, how we view ourselves. And so in any decision, when you want to make a decision about anything, you have to compare, you have to have a yardstick. What is good, what is bad, has to be compared to a reference. Where it is compared to a reference will tell you whether you want to do it or not. Without reference, it's very hard to tell what is good, what's bad, what's right and what's wrong. And that's why the role of religion, one of the most fundamental roles of religion, is to provide that reference point. Is to give us some point, some ruler, some marker, where we would measure things against and know where they are. Without it, things are very difficult to judge, very difficult to compare. And so when we move from being individuals, as I promised yesterday, that we move to kind of how we fit in societies, how we fit in groups, how we interact as genders, men with women, for example, how we interact as races, how we interact as nationalities, different age groups, different education levels, different incomes, we need that reference point. And knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us different tasks, different roles, different responsibilities, and there is justice, and there's a permanent absolute justice that will prevail in the end, will keep us on track in understanding the world. This is really important, brothers and sisters. One of the most challenging aspects of us, of communities like us, living in non-Muslim environments, is the question of identity. Who are we? When there is no conflict, it's fine. When there is no pressure, it's fine. It's easy to make decisions. The question is when there is a conflict, when we're under pressure, when we don't know where to go. What are we? Who are we? And if we bury this question under the carpet, if we don't prepare, if we don't understand when things are calm, in the cold state, as I've been calling it, it'll be very, very hard for us to make correct decisions in the hot states when we're under pressure. And so this is a question that will have a lot of impact. And for us to understand the world, essentially we shouldn't be asking questions about what to study or where to go or how to live or why is hijab required or not required, or why is gender interaction in Islam the way it is, why, those questions. Those questions can only be answered if you have established the framework. These questions can only be answered if you established who you are and what law do you want to abide by, essentially, what information you want to compare yourself against. And the role of law in any society is to provide a reference point. Every society, every civilized society has a legal system, a legal framework. Its role is to provide a reference point. And so this is important for us to keep in our minds, to understand that we are followers of Ahlul Bayt, that where we take our teachings from, what is valuable, what is important, what the inputs are, so that when we come to face decisions, we can compare them against a ruler and say, well, this is short and this is long, this is good and this is bad, this is acceptable and this is not. That's the first part. Secondly, within this, Islam, when Islam approached society, it created a framework for us. Who are we? So we spoke about these biases in our minds, how we exist as individuals in a society, and how we exist as a society. Who are we when it comes to each other? And here you see a very important point that we Muslims living in the West get exposed to all the time. An example of which is gender equality or inequality. An example of which is relationships in marriage. An example of which is friendships, and there are many other examples. The Western world, in an attempt to create a framework that's equal and productive for everybody, did something. So the fundamental of the system that we live in the West is premised on one thing. One of the key fundamental foundations of it is that there are no gender differences, that gender differences do not exist, that we are individuals. As an individual, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, there's no difference there, and you are an individual, and we should strive to create a society based on no gender differences. I touched on this yesterday, but I want to kind of talk about it a bit more in a deeper level, just to kind of clarify it before I move on to gender interaction, how we should do it in Islam. And so it's based on this premise that a lot of the drivers in society have existed. And this is a question, that's why I was talking about the reference point, because we come and say, does Islam believe in gender equality? Should men and women perform the same jobs? These questions can only be answered if we understand the reference point, if we understand where we're coming from. And so if you look at society in general, especially the Western society, but pretty much any other society, apart from how Islam created its society, and I'm not being exhaustive, there might be other societies, other examples, but I'm talking about these societies that we're familiar with. They exist on this premise. Historically, society existed as male and female. If you like, Islam obviously talks about creation and Adam and his wife, Hawa, and that was the foundation. I'll come to this in a second. But societies were created as kind of individuals with the dominance to whoever is stronger, essentially. Not stronger on any level apart from physical strength. And we know that human society has been dominated by male decision-making for thousands of years. Essentially, it's, as biologists put it, it was more like a hunter versus gatherer environment where hunters won every time. And we've moved on until this day and age where we find jobs, as I mentioned yesterday, jobs that are dominated by men typically pay a lot more than jobs dominated by women. And men and women doing the same job, men get paid more. In the US, the recent data, I think 2013 data, show that women get paid about 80% for doing the same job as a man. Essentially, 1 day per week extra for free. A woman works. And this seems to be like a noble thing to do. It is a noble thing to do. Two people doing the same job should be rewarded equally. But why doesn't it work despite all this effort? It doesn't work because it's based on a fundamental issue with the whole premise. That when you create the rules of a system, when you develop a system, that system will impact the outcomes of those who take part. Let me give you an example. I'm going to invent a new game. My new game is going to be called basketball. Nobody's done that before. It's a new thing. This basketball has a court and 5 players on each side, and you have a basket at a certain height, and people have to score. Who do you think will take part in this sport? Tall people or short people? Even if everybody takes part, who's going to win the match time and again? So what do you do if the game is based on height? If height gives you an advantage, years later it will be dominated by tall people by definition, because they'll win every time. And so then you have two options. One is to say tall people are not allowed to play the game. You put a height restriction. Actually, there's a league in the US, a less known league, that did that. So there was a height restriction. They're saying people above a certain height cannot play. That's one way of doing it. But what does that do? That would probably reduce the quality of the game overall. I guess, basketball is big in the US and you guys don't watch that league for a reason. Or you just let it be free, let it behave like a market, in which case those who have an advantage will win. If you say, if my game of basketball would be open to both genders, who do you think will win? Not because men are more skilled, they'll win because they're taller. Unless women happen to have an exceptional advantage in the way they throw the ball. In which case, it's still not a fair game because they're so much better at throwing the ball, they still get a similar result. Essentially, it's an inherent mistake in the design of the system. So if the world measures physical strength, women will lose. If the world measures language skills, women will win every single time because the average woman speaks 7,000 words, the average man speaks 2,000 words in English. So there's an inherent difference. It's like you cannot do it. If you say, I'm going to give higher salaries, I'm going to let society be led by those who are able to express themselves better, it will be women every time. If you say, I'm going to allow those who can be aggressive or fight, it's men every time. Essentially, we often neglect this, that the design of any system, any arrangement, will almost always determine the outcome to some extent. It's not the only variable, but it is an important variable. And so when you come to this society, which has been created by men, how did some men become? Let's just go one step back. Who makes decisions in societies? Those who make decisions are those who are powerful, right? Those who own something, have money, have power, have a skill, have something. So over time, those people will change the rules of the game because they're powerful. They change the rules of the game to suit them. They write history, they create institutions, they do it. So how did these people initially win? They won because they were stronger. When they went for the same hunt, one was stronger than the other one, maybe killed his colleague and took the kill. So he had families and he became the tribal leader and he set the rules based on physical strength. And so when we come decades later to a society which has come from this background, it will be male-dominated by definition. You will not be able to reach equality. Actually, I was reading a report earlier on today, just to kind of part of my research, and there was an optimistic, as the report puts it, this is a think tank that focuses on these issues, an optimistic estimate that we will reach parity, that's equal pay, by 2056 in the US, if all the measures get implemented. If all the measures get implemented. But I would argue it won't happen. It won't happen simply because those who are in a position, because the system inherently gives an advantage. What happens then is a woman can only win if she is so much better than her male colleagues, which is not a fair thing to do. In fact, research shows that women in business, and men in business, but women in business prefer male bosses than female bosses. And this is interesting. They describe female bosses as very aggressive. Essentially, for a woman to succeed in the world of work as we see it, as we have it, she needs to be as aggressive or more aggressive than typical men to succeed. Essentially, she is a man. Just that the fact she is female doesn't really make a difference. She is behaving like a man. What's the problem with this deal? The problem is we lost half the quality of society. We lost the power of differentiation and diversity. We lost something very important by turning everybody into one version. We lost the powers of the other version. And the only way to address it is to approach it very differently. And so you see, Islam from the start didn't say society is an individual, never. It always said the most basic unit of society is the family unit, is a couple. When the Quran speaks of creation, speaks of min dhakarin wa untha, Adam and Hawa. It's always a unit. Less than that unit, it's not a society. And so it's not individualistic, it's not collectivist. It's a system built on a unit where both sides, their role is to bring the best in each other. It's integration. Essentially, it's a system based on specialism. Those who have read Adam Smith, and many centuries before that, the narrations of Ahlul Bayt, speak of division of labor. Division of labor, they say it's a huge step in the success of humanity. That when individuals used to do everything for themselves. They used to go hunt and then farm if they needed and make their clothes and do everything. It's when somebody started to specialize. I will make bread for myself and for you, and you will bring meat for yourself and for me. So you became a butcher and I became a bread maker, a baker. When we did this, this was a huge step in society's evolution and development. And so that's how Islam did it. Islam says we have men and women, both are better in some aspects, both are worse in some aspect. The team is better than both. A team of a man and a woman is better than two men, it's better than two women. It is how we now build companies. When you build a company, do you hire, let's say you have applications and then you get some, people with certain, let's say you want to build a company and you get brilliant salespeople approaching you, applying to you. Do you just build a team from salespeople? Or do you have the best salesperson and the best marketing guy and the best strategy guy, the best finance guy, and then you do it that way? If you're building an organization, do you just bring a bunch of speakers? Or do you bring a speaker and an organizer and somebody who has good networks and good community relationships? Essentially, you bring different skill sets to build a team that's better than the individuals. And that's how Islam creates society. And so this is why the shift is so important when Islam arrived to the society before Islam, which was similar like to many other societies. It was less refined, of course, than our society today, but was built on a similar premise. It was a society that relied on physical strength, where women were almost seen as a burden, simply because you ate almost the same as your brother, but you produced a lot less. When you were invaded, you couldn't defend yourself. In fact, you were looted as a woman. And then you became kind of almost a burden on the family. And so the strange solution to the problem is to sometimes kill their daughters. They buried them alive to avoid the hassle that they saw in females. This is the society that the Prophet came to, and the Quran talks about this. In a verse, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدْهُمْ بِالْأُنْثَى ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مُسْوَدًّا وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ يَتَوَارَى مِنَ الْقَوْمِ مِنْ سُوءِ مَا بُشِّرَ بِهِ. When one of them is told you have a daughter, they would hide. And they contemplate this decision. Do I hold on and be humiliated, or do I kill this daughter? And they used to bury their daughters alive. And this is, by the way, I'm not talking about centuries before the Prophet. This is at the time of the Prophet. Some of the companions of the Prophet had done this before Islam. An example of which is Umar ibn al-Khattab. He buried more than one daughter before Islam. And there's a story, I'm not going to tell it to you because it's heartbreaking, how he describes his little baby as he buried her before Islam. Islam came, said that foundation does not work. We're not going to say it's a man's world, women are welcome to compete. We're going to say it's a different world. We're going to change it, shift it, and give both rights and responsibilities, give both a position in society that's irreplaceable, that's unique, that together with the other person can integrate and can build something better. Why do I talk about this? Because I think it's really important for us. You know that yardstick, that reference point? If we don't understand the beauty of what we have and the rules that we have, we naturally would want to compete in a world where we have, especially the women in this room, will always be at a disadvantage. If we, however, together create a society that gives both a role, then both will. So Islam says a family is not about winning and losing. Society is not about winning and losing. Society is about everybody winning or everybody losing. It's not a competition. It's a productive process, where the focus of which is to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So see, the reference has changed completely. The reference is everybody takes whatever they have, do the best they can, and they will be rewarded in the future. That they need to pick the right partner, man or woman, that would bring the best in them so they can succeed and they can move forward and they can do something positive. It's a completely different frame, and changing that frame will change the outcomes and has changed the outcomes over a very short period of time. And yesterday I told you reminded you of the issue of lineage, how important lineage is, and how pretty much lineage was one of the most fundamental strengths in those communities. They're all about tribes, because a big tribe can win, can loot more, can have more money, can have more power. And Islam said lineage now, through the Prophet, goes through his daughter. He put his daughter in the center position. She is the connection between the Prophet, the first Imam, the future generation of Imams, and they always refer to themselves as the daughters of Fatima, the daughters of Ali, the daughters of the Prophet, the sons and daughters of the Prophet, the sons and daughters of Fatima. So that change in mindset is very, very important. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Now, how do we use this information? How do we use this fresh reference point when it comes to our interactions as a society? As males and females, the two kind of halves, if you like, of a unit of society. And then how do we control our biases and what comes out of our daily lives in that regard? You remember I talked about system 1 and system 2. System 2 being rational, calculated, learns quickly, but chokes when it's under pressure. System 1 being intuitive, quick, but very hard to teach, very hard to learn. The way you would think of them, a great analogy I read talks about a man riding an elephant. Just picture this. Huge elephant and a small man riding an elephant. Probably the size of the man is comparable to the head of the elephant. A very small man on a huge elephant. The elephant is system 1. That's your intuitive, biased system. And then the rational part is the man. Now the rational part can try and control, but if the elephant decides to go one direction, there's very little you can do. So if the elephant chooses to just run forward, good luck. What you can do is try and make sure that the elephant is in the right position before it decides to run. That's the best you can do, because once it decided to do something, there's very little you can do about it. And we talked about prevention, so how we stop ourselves being in situations where we are exposed to these biases, and some of the solutions that we would have. And I'll talk about kind of 4 categories of solutions that are relevant. But let me maybe start with an example. I had a group of friends, true story, group of friends a few years ago went to Prague. They really wanted a culturally immersive experience. They wanted to eat local food. They wanted to really get to know the culture, to see the country. But food was an important part because they really had never eaten. They're not familiar with Czech food, and they really wanted to see what that's like. So they went on a trip. It was a short trip. It was a weekend, I remember. It was the days of university. It was a weekend, and they wanted to do so much, to see a lot of things and kind of enjoy the city. They came back and we asked them, so how was the food in Prague? Because that was something they talked about endlessly for a whole week. So how was the food in Prague? They said, actually, we spent most of the time eating in McDonald's and Subway. And it was odd, right? Obviously, we laughed at them. I grant you that, but it was odd. And when you say, well, why? I never thought of it until years later in this way. They did, because they said every time we went to a place, they didn't speak English, we didn't speak the language. We couldn't understand the menu. We didn't know what the food was like. So we were busy visiting museums and getting to see the city. So by the time we kind of got to the food, we just didn't know what to eat. We got really hungry. We wanted to eat something. We could see a McDonald's. We know what that is. We go to it. And that happened for the 2 days. Now, why is this relevant, you'll think? This is a classic example of system 2, system 1. They have gone with an intention to do something. When they got there, they didn't understand the food. They were under pressure. So cold state, we will eat Czech food. Hot state, we don't know what we're doing. So we're going to search. But as they searched, they got hungry. Under pressure, in a hot state of mind, you go to biases. Biases, one of them is what you're familiar with. What am I familiar with? McDonald's. At least I know what they serve, so I'll go eat. That's how branding works, by the way. Think of yourself when you go to another state, if you don't have time, or if you go to another country when you don't know where you're going. You'll probably eat in American restaurants that you know. That's an example of a bias. Of you, and that's how branding works, by the way. That's why brands want to do that. That's why they're successful, because they give you that assurance that something I know is better than something I don't know. And so this is an example of us in a certain situation, under pressure, starting to use natural tendencies, natural biases. Now, if we think of the biases we have, one of the strongest drivers in who we are, one of the very important blessings of who we are, is our attraction to each other as males and females. This is a driving force for the continuation of humanity. This is so crucial. It's a bit like System 1. It's a blessing when it works most of the time, but it's a real curse when it doesn't, sometimes. So this important driver is really important. It's a bit like hunger for my friends. If they didn't have hunger, they wouldn't eat. So they would die probably of starvation. They needed to be hungry so they can eat. But when they were hungry, they started to do things that weren't what they set out to do, what they wanted to do in the first place. And so under pressure, in situations like these, when we find ourselves distracted, we do one of two things. We either slip up, do something we're not supposed to do religiously, Islamically, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, or we fail in something else. Research, my brothers, my sisters, there's a lot of research that looked at secondary education in mixed schools versus, so kind of co-ed versus single-sex schools. And consistently, performance in single-sex schools, this is Western research, US research, for example, single-sex schools, people in those schools do better in science, in maths, in English. And psychologists, sociologists looked at why that is. And one of the key conclusions is that they wanted, and I'm going to quote, they wanted to separate social and academic concerns. They thought if somebody is dealing with social concerns and academic concerns, they do badly in academia. By the way, the concern wasn't what happens on the social level. So there probably would have been major problems on the social level, right, in terms of unhappiness, broken hearts, teenage pregnancies, all sorts of problems that will keep haunting society in the future. But we're talking about the education. And I guess I had this bias myself, I thought men would actually do worse. Both genders did badly, women actually did even worse than men. So the drop in co-ed was greater, was bad in both genders, it was greater in women. In that particular study, by the way, another study might show something slightly different. But the results are consistent. What bothers me here, why does that happen? What happens is you will find yourself in a situation where you are under pressure, where you're being distracted. And you will either let yourself slip, essentially have a relationship or commit adultery, whether it's through looks, whether it's through conversations, whether it's more than that, or you put a limit to that. But that takes mental resources, remember? That takes a lot of our mental resources, which means you can't focus on maths. You will not be as effective in your learning. And so how does Islam approach the same issue? Approaches it very differently. This is why sisters, brothers, and I'm talking about brothers and sisters here, this is why hijab is important. So if you don't understand this context, if you don't understand how our minds work, if you don't understand these biases and the positions when we are in and how we behave, you might see it as a restrictive, unnecessary thing. Why do we do that? Why do we need to do that? Why do women have to do that? Hijab, by the way, brothers and sisters, is for both men and women. Islam doesn't say hijab is for women. Hijab is for both. It's just the parts that needs to be covered are defined differently. That's it. But hijab is for both. Hijab also is not the piece of cloth. And this is crucial. Hijab is an attitude. It's a system. And so, having said this, it becomes obvious why something that might cover the parts of the body that needs to be covered for men and women, just tick those boxes on a minimum level, but it still provokes the same reactions in the other gender. You could see why that doesn't make sense. Because the point is not to descend in a position where we have to work so hard to stay where we are. The point is that we are free from this pressure. The point is to be in the cold state, or to be as far away from the hot state as possible. That we are in a comfortable position. So if we cover up but don't really cover up, if we cover up but dress up to impress, then what have we achieved? We've achieved some things, but we haven't achieved everything we could achieve. And this is how Islam controls and frees us from this bias, from this pressure. By creating environments, by controlling mixing. Islam says mixing needs to have limits. There are ways where men and women can work together, help each other, improve each other. But within the rules of Islam, there's a framework, because that's the purpose of the framework, is to create an environment where we have an equal chance of success, where we have the maximum chance of success. The point isn't that we continue to struggle with things that aren't necessary, that shouldn't really be there, that shouldn't limit our potential. And then there is a time and a place. So the way Islam deals with it, it minimizes the load on system too, as I said. It creates the concept of hijab to keep us in a position where we don't suffer so much from the pressure, and to control mixing. Very much in Islam, it's a system that's very, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but it's very clear cut. It prohibits everything and allows exceptions and encourages marriage. It says can't, can, should, please do. That's how it does it. It closes one door, opens another. And it's our responsibility as a society to not just to think about it for ourselves, to encourage it, to help each other towards that direction, because it's a fundamental institution that keeps us in the right frame of mind. So it's not something negative that Islam restricts interaction. It's actually something positive to free our minds, to let us achieve and succeed in other parts of life, and to have this option when we want to, in the right context, in the right framework. And one of the other things that I discussed previous nights about what works with System 1 and 2, what works with these things, is rules, not discretion. Do you remember that? Rules, not discretion. Don't say, I'm a good person. That's how psychologists say. That's what behavioral economists say. They say, don't say, I know where my limits are. I'm an adult. I'm a responsible person. I will know when to take a risk, when not to take a risk. I'm a rational person. But remember the example I gave you of the doctors who know exactly how to perform a very simple procedure, and they do hundreds of it, well, millions across the US each year. You still need rules. That's who we are. When you put rules, you reduce the burden, you increase the chances of success, and you make us happier. Happier. And I spoke about happiness yesterday, and there's a lot of research that supports this. That when people put rules, they are measurably happier. And so that's why Islam puts rules. It doesn't say you can judge the situation. Because as you judge the situation, your ability to make decisions gets impaired. And as you go deeper, that's possibly an example why Islam prohibits alcohol fundamentally. You could say a very small amount of alcohol doesn't make you drunk. But if you drank a little bit of alcohol, why can't you drink another bit of alcohol? And then now that you're very slightly drunk, your inhibitions are lowered, so your next decision is slightly less, the quality of the next decision is less. And the next decision after that is even less. Think about it. If you start with 99.99%, you multiply it by 99.99%. After a while, it becomes a very small number. What if the next decision is not 99.99, it's 99, then 97, then 93, then 80? If you want, just grab a calculator and multiply these numbers. You'll see how low the number gets. And that's what happens. So you limit it, you put rules so we don't have discretion, so we don't have to struggle with it. So that we help each other, both men and women help each other focus on what matters to us most of the time. And when, in the right circumstances, we want to proceed in another direction, that's fine too. That's encouraged in Islam, actually. So you see how it works? It's a very different system based on a very different reference. It's the idea of integration and completion of each other. It's not the idea of competition. And it is within this, you see how you see, my sisters, my brothers, how Ahlul Bayt understood relationships and marriage as an institution, as a building block of society. They saw it as a step that will be followed by steps. They saw it as a way to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they always were aware of these different forces coming in making those decisions. And I just want to give you an example of how having the right frame of mind, having the right reference point, and making the right decision produces great results. Imam Ali alayhi salam, after the martyrdom, after his wife, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, passed away, she had told him before her death, obviously because of social reasons and other needs and many other good reasons, she encouraged him to marry somebody after her death. And Imam Ali didn't marry immediately, but after a while he decided to get married. When Imam Ali alayhi salam wanted to get married, he asked a brother of his by the name of Aqil, told him, I want you to recommend, and there are some important points here, I want you to recommend a woman from a family of strong men, of warriors, of brave, strategic leaders, people who can be depended on in situations of need. First point here, you notice that Imam Ali alayhi salam, contrary to his society, he knows a woman's genes and a woman's nurture makes a difference to his children. Society thought it's all to do with men. Women were, as one poet puts it, containers. They contain our children and they produce them. They viewed women as have no role in the upbringing of their children. وَإِنَّمَا أُمَّهَاتُ النَّاسِ أَوْعِيَةٌ, the poet says. Actually, Imam Ali saw it very differently. He understood the effect of genes, nature and nurture. He said, I want somebody who's both genes and bringing up has a track record of success, that she knows how to raise children. Aqil told him, and he was a very knowledgeable man of families, of connections, told him, there is a lady that fits that description. Her name is Fatima bint Hizam or bint Haram. Fatima bint Hizam is known, as we know her, as al-Baneen. Why al-Baneen? Because she's the mother of the boys. She had 4 boys. Al-Abbas and his brothers. So Imam Ali proposed to al-Baneen, married al-Baneen. Al-Baneen, after marriage, once she asked Imam Ali alayhi salam, Ya Abul Hassan, I don't want you to call me with my own name. We're all proud of our names. We all want to be known of who we are. Why? Don't use my name. He said, why? She said, when you call me Fatima, in this context, in this household, in this house, coming from you, Hassan and Hussein, it just brings very close memories of their mother. Their mother is called Fatima as well. You call me Fatima, coming from you, in this house, in these rooms. When you say Fatima, it reminds them of the tragedy of their mother, the loss of their mother. Call me something else. I'm prepared to give up my own name so that Hassan and Hussein don't get upset. And so this is how al-Baneen started her relationship, her marriage. Then Al-Abbas was born. Then his brothers, Abdullah, Uthman, Ja'far were born. And they were raised in the household of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Al-Abbas used to go to battle with his dad. His dad is Imam Ali alayhi salam, right? But he was protected. He wasn't allowed to go too far into the crowds. He was reserved for a future position. And Imam Ali was murdered. Abbas was a young man he was about 35 years old on the day of Ashura. So he was, when his father passed away, he was about 15. Remembers his dad very well. And al-Baneen nurtured her children not as equals to Hassan and Hussein. Al-Abbas, historians say, all his life, through his mother's bringing up, used to call Al-Imam al-Hussein Sayyidi. He used to refer to him from a position of, as Al-Imam al-Hussein is more senior to him, because he always understood that while they're brothers, Hussein is the grandson of the Prophet and Hussein is the Imam of the time. And he was very, very close to Al-Imam al-Hussein for years and years. And al-Baneen used to always encourage that environment. When Imam al-Hussein prepared to leave for Karbala, al-Baneen strongly encouraged all her 4 children, 4 boys, to go with Hussein to Karbala. And so they headed, and Al-Abbas had a little son by the name of Ubaidullah ibn al-Abbas, and Ubaidullah stayed with his grandmother al-Baneen. So she held him in Medina because he was young, and with the mother of the child, and Al-Abbas went to Karbala with Imam al-Hussein. Then, you know what happened next? On the day of Ashura, before the day of Ashura, how Al-Abbas was offered by relatives from his mum's side, he was offered to survive, to be given a chance to to be saved on that day, but Al-Abbas refused. He didn't even respond to that. He was so embarrassed that he had a relative who would give him assurance of safety when Hussein doesn't have assurance of safety. And the Battle of Karbala, Battle of Ashura raged. And Al-Abbas brought his brothers, said, brothers, I want you, this is the end now, and I want to see you go ahead of me. I want to see you go to battle. And they went one after the other. They would go, the sons of al-Baneen, they would go fight bravely and then got killed one after the other. Abbas watches his brothers. They go one after another. Then Al-Abbas alayhi salam goes. Al-Abbas alayhi salam goes to battle. We know he was the backbone of the army of Imam al-Hussein. Imam al-Hussein held him in special regard. This is Abbas. The family saw Abbas in a special way. He was the bearer of the standard. He was the backbone of the army. Al-Abbas goes to battle. And Al-Abbas, as you know, is killed that way with his arm severed away from Hussein next to the river. And the battle ends and Ahlul Bayt go through the bodies and see Abbas away from them and see the battlefield. And then they go to Kufa, they go to Syria, to Damascus, they come back via Karbala. And historians say when Ahlul Bayt returned to Karbala and saw the graves, Zainab alayhi salam asked Imam Zain al-Abidin, said, where is the grave of Abbas? He told her, grave of Abbas is away. Imagine Karbala, it's quite a distance from the grave of Imam Hossein and the other martyrs. It's a distance away. That's where Abbas was. And so she went to Abbas and she cried for Abbas. And Ahlul Bayt then moved together as a family back to Medina. Going back to Medina, to where they were, to al-Banin, with these news. All this time, al-Banin asked the question, what happened to Hussein? What happened to Ahlul Bayt? So before getting to Medina, Imam Zain al-Abidin sent somebody who was with him, tells him, go ahead of me to Medina, announce the news, because we're arriving in that state and people need to know, need to find out. So Bishr ibn Hadlam runs towards Medina, says, Ya ala Yathrib, O inhabitants of Medina, I've got some news for you. I've got some news for you. He never said what the news were. He just announced, Ya ala Yathrib, la maqama lakum biha. And they gathered, and they gathered, and they gathered. So this guy says, there was this lady, this woman, she had a little child on her shoulder. She was holding this child and she looked a bit distraught. She looked in a very different state of mind. And she asked me, what's happening? And he says, I'm screaming my lungs out. I'm saying, Ya ala Yathrib, la maqama lakum biha, qutil al-Hussein. I've been telling you that Hussein is being killed. And she's asking me, what happened? What happened to Hussein? She's in a state of mind. She doesn't seem to understand what I'm saying. I asked, who is this lady? They told me she is al-Banin. And I knew, and I wanted to, okay, I said, okay, she wants to know about her sons. I'm going to tell her in steps. And he started telling her from her youngest son, عظم الله لك الأجر, عظم الله لك الأجر. And she says, tell me about Hussein, I never asked you about my sons. Then he went to Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. He said, عظم الله لك الأجر بأبي الفضل al-Abbas. Historians say this little baby who's the son of Abbas, Ubaydullah ibn al-Abbas. This little baby, Ubaydullah ibn al-Abbas, fell off her shoulder. And she said, I never asked you about Abbas. Tell me what happened to Hussein. And he tells her, عظم الله لك الأجر بأبي عبد الله. And then the family arrived, and Zainab arrived. And then they all would sit together and cry. al-Banin was known for years after that. She would sit by the graveyard of Baqi', close to the mosque of the Prophet. And she would say, لا تدعوني ويك al-Banin. Don't call me al-Banin after now. Don't call me the mother of the boys. I have no boys anymore. And she would say, and people would gather around her and cry, لا تدعوني ويك al-Banin. تذكريني باليوث العريم. I had sons and now they're lost, now they're dead. And she would cry, and she did this for a long time, and she would have Ubaydullah ibn al-Abbas, her little grandson, with her. My sisters, my brothers, this is an example of how to do it. This is an example of how to create that environment to succeed. Let us at the end pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He may give us guidance and clarity, that He may support us in those difficult times, both to resist when we should and to give in where we should, to make the right decisions, and especially those of us here amongst us and in other places, those who are in need of dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease their pain, grant their wishes, and keep us all on the right path. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.